Recently, I had the pleasure of talking to Scott Thornbury, a giant in the world of English language teaching. He is a teacher trainer, an award-winning author and speaker. And he has been pushing for change in the way we teach languages for more than 20 years. We spoke about teaching and teaching philosophy, and especially what teachers can do differently in the classroom and the importance of social learning. This is an edited version of our interview. If you would like to listen to the full version, you will find a link down in the description box. I hope you enjoy it. Scott Thornbury, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me today.
My pleasure, Christian.
So my first question to you, really, as a teacher trainer, as a person who teaches teachers, what do you think is wrong? What do you think are the things that are wrong with the world of English teaching today?
I mean, because there's so many contexts in which English is taught, and that's the thing, and you can't necessarily transfer the what works in one context. For example, teaching small groups of privileged Europeans in a private language school in London, for example, to a completely different context, which may be teaching 45 12-year-olds in a public school in Thailand. And the two things don't necessarily, all they've got in common is the English language as being the subject. But the purposes for which the learners are learning the language, the resources that are available, the time they've got available, etc., obviously the quality of the teaching, the native language of the teacher, and so on, produce all sorts of variables that, as I say, it's very difficult to generalize across these contexts. So I would be very nervous about saying what's wrong. I think if I had to say something very generally, what's wrong, and this is what's wrong with education, I would say in this day and age, is an obsession with testing, and an obsession with testing, not performance, as it were, not how well you can use the language in terms of how effectively you can communicate, but what you know about the language in terms of its itty-bitty grammar, etc.
Really, they're testing how good your memory is, right? It's just more about memorization than real kind of learning. And I suppose that brings us on to the next subject, which I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about Dogma, which is I don't know what to call it, a philosophy, a methodology? A
way of life, I don't know. Dogma, just to give you a little bit of background for those who are watching who don't know, was a response to a felt need that I and my colleagues had in our teacher training courses here in Spain, that teachers, and this was like 20 years ago, that the teachers we were training were so dependent on their resources, their materials, their course books, their technology, etc., that they were missing the bigger picture, which really relates to what I was just talking about with exams, that they were becoming focused on teaching the course book, for example, and not teaching the learners, or teaching the grammar McNuggets in the course book, but ignoring the communicative effect.
Actually, I have some text here that you actually wrote on a Yahoo group 20 years ago, and it says here, we are a mix of teachers, trainers, and writers working in a wide range of contexts who are committed to a belief that language learning is both socially motivated and socially constructed. And to this end, we're seeking alternatives to models of instruction that are mediated primarily through materials and whose objective is the delivery of grammar McNuggets. We're looking for ways of exploiting the learning opportunities offered by the raw material of the classroom. That is, the language that emerges from the needs, interests, concerns, and desires of people in the room. Now, and this sort of leads me into sort of two questions. The first one is, isn't that kind of common sense? And the second thing is, in the 20 years, how much change have you seen? Because that seems to describe a continuing problem.
When we propose proposed that teachers perhaps become less dependent on their materials and focus more on what's going on in the room, a lot of experienced teachers particularly said, well, that's what we do. That's what we've always done. You're not telling us anything new. And I think this is proven. Research that's been done into teachers' life trajectory or professional trajectory shows that, yes, most teachers start off being very dependent on materials on the course book, very focused on techniques, etc. And as they start to become more fluid, as it were, in their teaching, in their classroom management and the routines that they've learned, they free up and they become more responsive, more reactive to the learners. And I think this is what most teachers experience. And I guess what disappointed us in our teacher training courses here in Barcelona was the fact that we were getting many teachers coming for training who had been teaching for 3 or 4 years, but still seemed to be very hooked on grammar McNuggets. And so what we did, we were rather radical and said, well, listen, we want you to try teaching with fewer materials and being more responsive to the learners, more communicative in the sense of the communicative approach, which is, after all, what 20 years ago these teachers were subscribing to theoretically, but they weren't really doing in the classroom. And we saw tangible results when we said to teachers, like, stop, leave all those materials behind and interact with the learners, set up activities which involve the learners talking about or writing about the things and interacting about the things that really concern them, and then use that language that comes up, that emergent language, as the kind of content of the lesson.
That's one of the three sort of parts of Dogma is when you start, you take a vow of chastity, and basically you sort of say, I'm not going to use a workbook.
Yeah, I mean, when I first wrote the article that came out, which sort of launched Dogma, inadvertently, I have to say, because it was just a small 2-page article which simply said we're over-dependent on materials. And I used the analogy of this Scandinavian film movement, which had 5 years previously said we're too dependent on technology and making films. Let's go back to the basics. I thought, well, that's a nice analogy. So that's how it started, just as an analogy, as a metaphor, if you like. It was never intended to be a method. But further down the track, after attracting quite a lot of attention, after a very busy discussion group online, my colleague Luke Meddings and I decided it was time to put together a kind of synthesis of what Dogma, in a sense, represented in 2009. And we wrote a book called Teaching Unplugged, which was basically ideas for teachers or routines or techniques or activities, which in a sense gave them a foothold into this philosophy. And you mentioned the word, I think, social at one point. That, yes, it was in that description of Dogma. The social basis of language and of language learning is something that has become very prominent in those 20 years since Dogma was first proposed. And that's essentially what Dogma was trying to do, was trying to socialize language learning by bringing language back to its original purpose, which is to cement social ties effectively, or to allow people to become socialized into a particular community of language users.
Well, why do you think that Dogma hasn't been, why isn't that just the default mode, if you know what I mean?
Well, I think for many teachers it is. Interestingly enough, if you talk to teachers who started their teaching career sort of backpacking around Asia, doing English lessons, I'm talking about a particular demographic here, probably young native speaker, gap year kind of kids, straight out of university. What are they going to do? They go to Vietnam for 2 years and they teach English and without any training. And they have a ball. They love it because they don't have the techniques. They don't know anything about the grammar. They just engage with the learners and have conversations. I'm not saying this is a good thing necessarily, but if you talk to those teachers, many of them then, if they decided that they liked teaching so much that they went on and got some training, they were very disappointed in their training because it sort of it acted as a constraint. It prevented them from doing the kinds of things that they really used to enjoy with teaching. A lot of people go into teaching with a kind of visionary,
Dead Poet Society.
Exactly. Now, I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing, but it's often knocked out of them to such an extent in their initial training that many people just forget it, leave it, drop out. I think this is no fun. This is not why I went into teaching, to teach the present perfect continuous. As I said before, so for some teachers, this is the default. It's like the socialization, the social approach to teaching language, learning through doing, learning through speaking, learning through conversation.
Well, I imagine that there are some teachers out there, like in Thailand or Vietnam or maybe Russia, who their job, day-to-day job, is teaching these McNuggets, and the only thing they know is the course book. And as you said, maybe they're new to the game, they don't have the experience. What would you say to those teachers? What could they do differently to sort of help their students?
Good question. I mean, I think it's a similar question which is asked about to proponents of task-based learning. How could we turn a traditional syllabus or a traditional course book into something which is more task-based? And I think one suggestion, and I didn't make it, but I mean, I think it's a good one, is that in a sense, you take that same material, but you turn it on its head. Now, if you look at any course book unit, any general English course at least, it's traditionally follows a kind of PPP approach. That is, some language is presented, then it is practiced in varying degrees of control, and then there is some production activity, either a spoken task or a written task or both. And along the way, there'll be some reading and some listening activities. And that's a pretty kind of standard...
Yeah, like flow, right?
Unit, yeah. For a change, I think one of the things you could do is turn it on its head, and start off with the production activity. So go to the speaking task that's the end of the unit and say, we're going to do this. Do it just as well as you can. I mean, talking here about learners who are probably beyond a kind of very basic level, but learners who are anything that from sort of intermediate and above, maybe you don't actually need to teach them all the language which the course book assumes that they need to know. Maybe you could use the production activity, the speaking task, as a sort of diagnostic task. Say, okay, let's do this. Let's do it, rehearse it, perform it, etc., record it or whatever, and then let's go back and see what it is that we could do that would improve it if we were to do it again. And that's when you might want to go back to the beginning of that course book unit and say, well, obviously it would have helped you doing this task if you'd had more vocabulary about X, Y, Z, or if you'd have this particular grammatical structure, in which case you can then teach those and then go back and do the task again. You may find, of course, that you don't need to go back. The students are perfectly good, and they've got enough, between them at least, they've got enough language knowledge to be able to perform the task perfectly adequate, if not fluently. So, but that's particularly at a higher level. So you save yourself an awful lot of time. You might be teaching things which are actually redundant because they already know them, or they know them well enough to be able to incorporate them into the activity. So it's a sort of it's a test, teach, test, if you like, approach to lesson design rather than a present, practice, produce. I think experimenting with that from time to time, you start to learn, A, what your learners are capable of, but also what you are capable of as a teacher in terms of responding what it is that, when things come up, you think, oh my, look, students don't seem to be aware of this, so I'll stop them, teach it, and then they can go back and do the task or continue the task again.
Because I don't know if you know of the playwright and writer David Mamet.
Yes, I do indeed.
Yeah, he wrote a book about how to make films, because he directs films as well.
Okay.
And in this is the first chapter of the book, he says the way to make any film better is to burn the first 10 minutes. Because then the audience comes into the film and they're just like, brilliant. What's happening? I don't understand. There's none of this sort of character development. And do you think that it would be an exaggeration to say that English teaching in general would be better if we just burned all the textbooks?
No, I would never go so far as to say that. I would make myself very, very unpopular.
But secretly, do you think that?
I think that David Mamet quote is great. I wasn't aware of that. And I think, yes, I like the analogy you're making there of saying, well, maybe if not burn the textbook, at least dispense with the first presentation stage of the lesson, the first 10 minutes, as it were, which is actually not often 10 minutes. Presentation of grammar tends to expand to fill the time available for it. That's another problem. And there's no time for the production activities. But if you start with a production activity, then chances are that there will be more minutes of real communication in the classroom than had you started with the grammar presentation. That's one thing.
Yeah, you might suddenly look and go, oh my God, 45 minutes is gone. My lesson's over. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. The other thing is the first 10 minutes of the lesson are key in terms of setting the mood and the theme. And one of the things that, of course, most teachers do at the beginning of a lesson is they have a short chat, because there's people coming in, taking their coats off, opening their bags, dropping things if they're kids, and there's a little bit of, you need to cover that. So what the teacher traditionally does, or is trained to do, is say, ask questions like, did you have a nice weekend? Have you seen any good movies lately? That kind of thing. And then the lesson will start once everybody's settled. Now, it's in my experience, both as a teacher and also as a teacher trainer watching teachers, so sometimes those 3 or 4 minutes of pre-lesson chat are the most interesting, because that's when things come up which you might not have anticipated, but which are of general interest. Somebody said, I saw a really interesting documentary on television last night. Oh, yeah, I saw that one, the one about pandas. And now the teacher's going, oh, yeah, pandas, nice, write it on the board. Okay, end of discussion, we're all ready. Page 56, let's start with the exercise. Hang on, stop there. Pandas, right, there's general interest in pandas here. Let's run with that. Let's just see where we can go with that. So you can get the students who saw the documentary to summarize more or less. Or you could say, okay, into groups, pairs, write down 3 things you all know about pandas, and let's see if we're all on the same page, metaphorically, and so on and so on and so on. And those 3 or 4 minutes can produce a whole, I've seen it and we've done it, a whole lesson of material that emerges out of those initial topics that the students themselves raise. It seems to me, yeah, there's a lot to be said for those first 10 minutes. Don't spoil them by moving straight into the course book.
I mean, if you had to describe language in one sentence, what do you sort of feel that language is? What's it for? Why do we have it?
Yeah, I mean, this comes back to the social again. Language, I didn't say this, I mean, the theories that underpin the communicative approach, I'm thinking of Halliday's systemic functional grammar, moved the focus onto language has a social function, that it is used socially. That is to say, it is used between people. I don't mean for socializing, like chit-chat. It's used in work and in studying, etc. But that's still social in the sense that it has a social function. It's not something that we simply think with. And it is learned, not just used, but learned in social context, like classrooms, or even one-to-one situation is still social in a sense. So it's bringing back the social into our understanding of what language is, what it does, and how it is learned. And that really is the most important thing for me in terms of how my thinking has kind of shifted over the years. And that's, in a sense, what Dogma represents. It's kind of bringing the social back into language learning.
Wow. Well, Scott Thornbury, thank you very much for your time. That was an amazing chat.
Thank you, Christian. It's been a pleasure.